The safety, honor and welfare of your country comes first. Your own ease and comfort will come last.
You are charged with Indian Army Act Section 41, waging war against the king.
Fire! रात दिन अपने सीने विच वजदी आजादी दे राग नूं बंद कर ला। सब तो पहला मैं हिंदुस्तानी हाँ।
Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Vishal Dahiya and today we will discuss the tactical and strategic challenges before Indian Navy. The Indian Navy has come a long way from the non-aligned era to the Malabar exercise. The tactical and strategic requirements have also undergone a lot of change. The Maritime Security Strategy of 2015 clearly points out Navy's expanding roles and responsibilities in the Indian Ocean. However, the Indian Navy forces faces several challenges in possessing the capabilities that would be required for the degree of maritime dominance in the Indian Ocean. The Navy's fleet is aging, with an estimated 60% of the vessels reported to have reached various stages of being termed as obsolete. Warships under construction are suffering considerable cost and schedule overruns. A recent CAG report says Indian Navy's ships and submarines were involved in 38 accidents from 2007 to 2016, affecting the operational preparedness of the force. It also raised questions on the lack of institutional framework and the force to deal with issues related to safety. The depleting underwater capabilities of Indian Navy seems to have been given a shot in the arm, with the government initiating much awaited process to acquire 6 new submarines under Project 75. For a detailed discussion on the strategic and tactical challenges ahead for the Indian Navy, we have with us a distinguished panel of guests in the studio today. Let me introduce you to them, starting with Mr. Saikat Datta. He is the consulting editor, Scroll.in. We also have retired Commander Abhijit Singh. He is the head of the Maritime Policy Initiative at ORF. And we also have with us Rear Admiral retired K. Raja Menon. He is a strategic analyst. Let me begin with you, Saikat, and let us straight away come to the recent reports, specifically with respect to the Navy, which has been put in Parliament and public domain by the Control and Auditor General. There are several questions which are raised, and those questions specifically points to lapses in terms of some policy decisions not being taken and some not being executed in the naval force. So what kind of picture does it emerge if you go through that CAG report in the present context?
So, to understand the context, if you were to look at why we need a good Navy and a strong Navy, the rising concerns with the issues that we have with China is an immediate concern, which is why we need a very strong and robust Navy, because the Indian Ocean region, the IOR as we call it, is going to become a major point of strategic concern for both countries. And we've already seen the Chinese use the South China Sea as an area where they have been showing a lot of belligerence.
And the 2015 Maritime Policy specifically makes Indian Ocean as a core area.
Etc. Also, energy security, and as you know, India's energy securities all depend on imports, and all that comes through the sea, which is why again energy security of India depends greatly on how effective the Indian Navy is in not only securing the sea lanes of communication which are of great interest to us, but also in ensuring that we continue to have a steady supply when there is an exigency. And also, you see, for any great nation which has aspirations of being a superpower, unless and until you have a good Navy, none of that is of any concern, because you see the Air Force will always have a limited reach and the Army will have an even lesser reach. It will all finally boil down to the Navy. And unfortunately in India, when it comes to acquisitions in the Navy, they've always been sort of placed third after the Army and the Air Force.
Okay.
And as far as underwater capabilities are concerned, if you were to just look at Project 75, tremendous delays, and also when we contracted in 2005 for 6 Scorpion French submarines, besides the controversies around it, it has been delayed inexorably, forcing India to cough up more and more payments, and has taken us nowhere. And today our underwater capability is practically non-existent, but for the German HDW submarines.
HDW submarine. Let me bring in Mr. Abhijit here, and let me pose the same question to you, since you've been part of the force. These points which have been raised by the CAG, specifically with respect to 38 accidents, and most of them being attributed to the so-called manpower issues. Is that something which at this stage we can put up with?
Well, I'll just begin by saying that there is no denying the fact that this is a cause for concern. But let's look at what the CAG report says in a little depth and detail. The CAG essentially brings up 4 issues to my mind. One of the issues that it brings up is about the delay in project construction. And it brings up the issue of the Kamortha class, the P-15A. And it says that that there was the problem in the way that the ship was designed, because just in the 4 or 5 years after its first design was decided, there were about 15 modifications made. It then comes to issues of safety, and it brings up the issue of the submarines, the submarine accident that happened in Bombay a few years ago, and it says that there seems to be no institutional framework in the Navy for this. The third issue that it brings up is about weapons and sensors, and I read that report very carefully, and it says that there should have been many weapons and sensors installed on the Kamortha class, but many weren't. And finally, it brings up the issues of inventory control, to say that the Navy's inventory control seems to be inadequate. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in the US Navy, which is by far the most developed Navy in the world, when the Gerald Ford class, which is their new aircraft carrier, was being commissioned, it took a long time to be commissioned. Exactly the same issues came up. There was a great deal of recrimination and hand-wringing and cynicism about, and it continues to be so, about the Gerald Ford class. I can also tell you that the littoral combat ship, which is the US's sort of principal weapon in the South China Sea, also came up for a great deal of discussion. They said that it somehow didn't seem appropriate to the challenges that the US Navy faced. So I'm saying that the Indian Navy is not unique in facing these problems. Okay. Let's face it, the development of a maritime industrial complex is a slow, iterative process. I'm not defending the problems that Navy has been through, but these problems are bound to happen. The Navy is taking all the measures that are required, and I think in the days to come there will be an improvement on this front.
Okay, so you're saying these problems are not unique to Indian Navy. Let me bring in the man who's can be said falls in the category, who's been there and done that. You've commanded ships, you've commanded subs, you've been at the core of it all. Mr. Menon, do you agree with these 2 contentions? Specifically, one, the fact that the Indian Navy is these problems are not unique to the Indian Navy. 1, and 2, are we at a position right now where we should be taking these 2 separate things very seriously? 1, the kind of incidents which are happening, 38 accidents in 9 years, and other issues related to safety, and 2, issues related to the acquisition as well.
Well, 38 accidents over a period of 9 years is not something to be alarmed about, except that 1 or 2 accidents were high profile accidents, and that necessarily brought the attention of the CAG onto the subject of accidents. But otherwise, I mean, the loss of that submarine was a catastrophic event, and that happens to navies very rarely. And if that had not happened, I don't think the CAG would have concentrated on accidents as per se. But for me, what is more important is what the CAG has not brought out.
Okay.
And that is the fact that in the challenging requirements for funding for various government departments, the government is downsizing the allocation to the armed forces as a whole. There was a time when the armed forces were getting something like 3% of the country's GDP.
That has come down.
That's come down to 1.6 or 1.7.
1.7%.
Now, that indicates the government's desire or will to spend money on defense. And if the government is not willing to spend money on defense, it will have a cascading effect downstream on everything, particularly the Navy, which has been the most poorly funded of the three services. So, I don't think you can blame the Navy for being put in a situation where the funding has been so curtailed that you can hardly build any ships, submarines and aircraft.
Okay, so funding is a major issue. You were also saying that Navy remains the least preferred child out of the three armed forces as far as the funding part is concerned. Is there something in the offing right now? You're looking at this particular issue at from a close quarter. Is there a will right now as far as the government is concerned, or some plan to ensure that there is a full flow fund?
I don't think that is the case for several reasons, and both my co-panelists may be able to correct me on this, but the fact is that India has always been a very land focused country when it comes to strategic issues, and has never given as much importance to the sea as it should. As a result, it has not been able to support the Navy as much as it should, and as Admiral Menon right now pointed out, the fact of the matter is that the kind of policies that you are seeing and you have seen in the past has never been very naval focused. And right now, and it's very unfair to Mr. Jaitley. Now, he is in a very difficult position today. As finance minister, he has to ensure that there is a lower and lower fiscal deficit, and he has to ensure that he gets the maximum bang out of the buck. As defense minister, he has to do exactly the opposite and try and spend some more. So it's completely unfair to him, but here you have a part-time defense minister who is at odds with a full-time finance minister trying to make sense of both. So this, I think, and this has happened for too long in this country. So just from that, and that is supposed to be the apex of defense planning and funding, and I don't see that being resolved, and the Navy actually beginning to gain from that.
Abhijit, do you agree with this contention? A part-time defense minister putting up with a full-time finance minister?
Well, on that part, I do agree with Saikat. But let me just say this, that there has been an increased political focus on the Navy in the past few years, and that has to do with the Modi government's understanding of the Indian Ocean region and the having a sort of personality of its own, and that India must somehow be the fulcrum for security and development in the region. So if you look at Prime Minister Modi's speeches or Foreign Secretary Jaishankar's speeches, this issue comes up quite often, that the Indian Navy must take the lead, take the initiative for security in the Indian Ocean region. And I see that in the next few years there is going to be a greater focus in terms of developing the Navy's assets. I don't think the Navy is going to languish. Whilst I agree with Saikat that there has been a land focus so far, increasingly I think there is an acknowledgement of the fact that the Navy must play a greater role, especially given the fact that the Chinese are getting so assertive, both in the South China Sea as well in the Indian Ocean region, typically their submarine deployments.
We'll come to the Chinese part of it a little later. Let me bring in Admiral Menon out here, and on an issue which I'm pretty sure you will speak on that with authority. That's about the recent deal, which is now termed as mother of all underwater defense deals. Is that going to give a much required impetus to the underwater power of the Navy? The deal, which is termed to be somewhere around 50,000 crore rupees, Project 75, when India will get 6 submarines?
You know, as time passes, weapons get more expensive. So, as time passes, you will keep coming across this a new mother of all deals.
So this will keep on changing?
That will keep on changing. I don't think that's going to have such a great effect.
Okay.
But the issue is that the requirement for the 6 submarines was projected in the late 90s.
Yeah, it has been almost more than a decade delay.
More than a decade since they have materialized. So we will barely be keeping up with the rate of obsolescence of the existing force. So what we really should be doing is, are we going to make a stand in the Indian Ocean?
Okay.
Because China's GDP, for instance, I know you want to bring in China later. But
let's
China's GDP is something like $11 trillion, and our GDP is less than 3 trillion.
Less than 3 trillion.
So we have an asymmetric relationship, and the only place, the only sphere of activity where we can give the Chinese a hard time is the Indian Ocean.
Okay.
Now the question is, the government has got to decide, do we want to do this or not? Because if you don't do that, then we will be outflanked as far as the mountain passes are concerned. They have downsized the army, they have made more mountain divisions, they have made more mechanized divisions, they have built logistic chains. So they have outflanked them there, and their air force is much larger than ours. But as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, we still have an edge. Do we want to exploit that edge as far as geopolitics is concerned or not? And if we do, then the government has got to put more money into the Navy. It can't give the money something which was asked for 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier, and say, you know, we've done our bit.
And terming it as a mother of all defense.
Yes.
Let me bring in Abhijit here. Abhijit, since Admiral Menon has also brought in the Chinese angle and the geopolitics of it and Indian Ocean. I have some figures out here with me, and these are some of the estimates. There's a comparison between the Chinese Navy and the Indian Navy. In terms of destroyer, they have 26, we have 11. In terms of frigates, they have 52, we have 14. In terms of the missile boats and other such small ships, they have 106, we have 25. We seem to have had an edge over the years in terms of having an aircraft carrier. But it seems that in a few years from now, we will lose that edge as well. So are we very asymmetrically placed?
Well, I wouldn't say we are asymmetrically placed. Let's look at the Chinese naval strategy in say, the Indian Ocean region. Now, as opposed to the South China Sea, which is a core interest for China, the Indian Ocean is a region where they have geopolitical interests, to a degree some strategic interests, because a lot of Chinese trade flows through this part. This is a highway that kind of connects the Chinese waters with the waters of Africa, the Middle East, and so that's the Chinese interest in this region. And what they are likely to use in this region is what some of us have called passive leverage. They're going to very nicely combine an economic strategy with a military strategy. So they're going to have these places, or call them bases, in Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar, etc., Pakistan. And they are going to combine that with a little bit of maritime presence to basically have some strategic leverage in the Indian Ocean region. This stands apart from the kind of aggression that they are showing in the South China Sea. So I don't think the Chinese are coming into the Indian Ocean region to pick a fight with India. So that question of a confrontation doesn't come in. It's also important to note that Chinese are using the high seas. They're not in Indian territorial waters. So even if you want a sea denial strategy to work against the Chinese in peacetime, it is unlikely that we will be able to utilize such a strategy.
You're right, but as Admiral Menon pointed out, isn't it high time for us to decide whether or not we want to exploit that advantage which we have in Indian Ocean? You're right that this want to have a strategic leverage in the Indian Ocean, not coming here to pick up a fight. But then, if they want to have a strategic leverage, we also should utilize our advantage.
That is absolutely right, and on that point, I'm with Admiral Menon. I remember a piece he'd written for the Hindu a couple of years back where he made that issue. That is correct. That if things get bad on the border, if there's a front that can be utilized to India's advantage, that is the Indian Ocean region, especially the South Asian littorals. And in that space, I think we should have a degree of dominance. Okay. And therefore, the government must support some of our initiatives to have the aircraft carrier, the submarines, especially the amphibious ships, etc.
Again, Saikat, in your observation, do you see this trend catching up with the Indian policymakers?
Not really, and here I'll have a slight polite disagreement with what Abhijit is saying.
Okay.
For the simple reason that he said that look at the speeches of the Prime Minister and the others, and there is greater focus, etc. You see, speeches are only expressions of intent. But where is the actualization or implementation of that intent?
Decisions and its implementation.
So what you are talking about, as Admiral Menon rightly pointed out, you are talking about Project 75, which is for 6 submarines. There is a Project 75A for more submarines. And today we are in a state where our existing sanction levels, we are not able to maintain that. So when these new submarines, if and when they come in, they will only replace what has been phased out. So if we are today having 9 or 10 functional submarines, these will only replace those which are functioning and will be obsolete by they coming in. So it does not actually mean an expansion of the current strength.
So we'll just be able to manage
the existing force levels, while we should be looking at expansion of this. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that today, and these are publicly available credible figures, look at the number of times Chinese submarines have visited and arrived in not only in Pakistan but also Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and how many Indian submarines have shown up in any of the areas which are of Chinese concern. So that asymmetry is a great comment and a great revelation of what is the Chinese intentions today. That's one. And two, if you look at it, why are they sending and displaying this underwater capability? As my co-panelists have pointed out, it all shows on trade. Now, maritime trade will, the Chinese have created this Belt Road Initiative and CPEC, etc. for over the land trade. But to my mind, it's far fetched that they will be able to overtake maritime trade. So ultimately, China and Made in China 2025 will greatly depend on how functional their maritime trade is, and this can only be sort of guaranteed through a good underwater capability, which the Chinese are already demonstrating.
Which can ensure the security of the
Plus,
maritime
they
trade
already
routes.
own Djibouti. They already have created a naval base in Djibouti. They have created a naval base in Gwadar, which is practically owned by them, in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar. So that's the kind of presence we are looking at.
Okay, quite a number of concerns which Saikat is pointing out. Admiral Menon, I'll bring you in here. We're running short of a time, but in the same line of thought, there's another report which points out that even the plans for the indigenous aircraft carrier 2, IAC-2, are being put on back burner. So is that also, can that also be looked in the same term that we're not on the right path?
Yeah, definitely, because it's 76 years since we last fought a war. So when you say that what are navies for, what are armies for, the army will say it's to protect territory, the Air Force will say protect airspace, the Navy will say protect its seaward assets, and do one thing which the other services can't do, which is project power. And projection of power, you need aircraft carriers. And as far as geopolitics is concerned, other countries are worried as to what can a certain country do beyond its borders. They're not interested in how big your army is. They want to know what can you do outside the borders of your country.
Okay.
And when your diplomats speak, can they speak with the backing of external power projection? Otherwise, you're just indulging in words.
Okay.
And diplomacy can't be conducted without the backing of power projection force. And that's where the Navy comes in. And as far as the Navy is concerned, that's where aircraft carriers come in. If you don't have aircraft carriers, you can't do power projection. And if you can't do power projection, you can't do geopolitics.
Okay, can't do geopolitics. Let me bring in Abhijit here, and on a slightly different note, obviously all these will be important contours of that particular note as well, and that was something which was pointed out by Saikat in the initial stages of the discussion. That is the energy security aspect of having a strong naval force, augmenting the capabilities of our maritime forces, and having that policy move ahead in that direction.
That is correct. Let me just make a small comment on the power projection capability that Admiral Menon very rightly brought out. I think it's very important to have power projection capability for the simple reason that in peacetime, it makes sense to have your maritime power being projected in areas that the opponent considers to be a sphere of influence. So if we had, for instance, our ships operating or our submarines operating in the South China Sea and the East Sea, that would send a stronger message to China than having our ships simply patrol the Indian Ocean sea lanes. So just on that metric, I think it is important for us to recognize the importance of power projection. Admiral Menon makes a very good point. On your question about the
energy
security, yes, of course. I think, and this is getting back to the point that Saikat was making, that the policy focus on energy security by itself underlines the importance of the Indian Navy. I think on a number of occasions, including at the Raisina dialogue held a couple of months back at the Observer Research Foundation had organized it, the Foreign Secretary Jaishankar did mention that the Navy simply has to be strengthened because it is a critical element in ensuring the energy security of India as well as some of our neighboring countries in the Asia Pacific. But I think the primary driver will continue to be the Chinese power projection in the Indian Ocean region, even though I agree that energy security has its own importance.
Okay, so is that on the same lines as what you're pointing out, so specifically with regards to the energy security?
Oh, absolutely, because without a good, strong Navy, if they are able to choke our energy sea lines of communication where our energy is coming in from, then you are in deep trouble.
Something which China is doing, securing its maritime trade.
Especially with its underwater capability. And I might quickly mention, 10 years ago, American admirals used to laugh at how Chinese submarines make a lot of noise. Today, they are wondering that what kind of technology they are using because they have become so silent. The Americans are worried. So we need to understand how technological leaps the Chinese are making while we haven't even developed that capability in-house.
Okay, so it seems that as our panelists were pointing out, we cannot undermine the importance of Indian naval forces, not only in terms of the energy security, but also in terms of power projection with respect to our neighbors, specifically China and its operations in South China Sea and its presence in the Indian Ocean as well. We'll come back next week with a different topic and a different set of guests. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.